Hey everyone, thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about the Altcoin Reckoning. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. The Altcoin Reckoning series is something that we've been following for probably about just over a year and a half now. And the general expectation of the altcoin reckoning is that altcoins bleed profusely on their Bitcoin pairs. And they should do it while Bitcoin goes up. They should do it while Bitcoin goes down. It is just the nature of the altcoin reckoning. The hard part with the altcoin reckoning is that if you're not following altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs, you might be somewhat ignorant to how well they are holding up or the lack thereof, right? And this was me once upon a time too, right? Like it's just like that's if you're new to the market, the the value of Bitcoin pairs, Satoshi valuations might not be as obvious. It normally takes a full cycle to appreciate it. So if you haven't appreciated it this cycle and it's your first cycle, well, then I think you sort of get a free pass, right? It takes a cycle to appreciate it. If it's not your first cycle, then you have no excuse, right? And I mean, take a look in the mirror. Now, what I want to talk about in this video is we want to look closer at the altcoin reckoning. We want to talk about, what are some likely outcomes? What are we looking at right now? Go through some of the prior metrics that we've looked at and just try to take inventory on what is going on right now in the altcoin market. Now, the altcoin market can be described in this way in terms of everything besides Bitcoin and Ethereum. Now, a stricter definition would be everything besides Bitcoin, and we will also look at that as well. But we're going to start off by looking at everything besides Bitcoin and Ethereum. And you get something known as Total 3, which is the altcoin market. One of the things about the altcoin market is that while Bitcoin has had some pretty impressive moves this year, the altcoin market just simply continues to put in one lower high after another. And every single time we get a pump in the altcoin market, it leads to a lot of bulls, perma bulls for altcoins that basically shield them all the way down. It causes them to then dunk on the bears, the people that are bearish on the altcoin market. The problem, at least what I've learned throughout prior cycles, as long as that behavior persists, then an argument could be made that the altcoin reckoning is not over. It's not really until everyone gives up on the altcoin market when the idea of buying an altcoin, it seems somewhat repulsive that the altcoin reckoning actually is over. And while I know if you're watching this channel and if you have subscribed to these views for the last couple of years, you might already feel that way, and you've probably felt that way for a long time. But if you go to other sectors of the cryptoverse, you will find a very different sentiment on other channels. Very different. And it's been that way for the entire year, and it was also that way last year as well. Now, the issue is that as long as these people just keep dunking every time the altcoin market goes up, right? They dunk on the people that were bearish. It's sort of a sign that the market hasn't really, finished with the altcoin reckoning. Now, one thing that we've followed before is the NASDAQ, right? So we've followed the NASDAQ a lot back in the Dotcom crash. And I will remind you that it took, 2.5 years to finalize, okay, this .com crash. And what you will notice is that it has, and it continues to look eerily similar as to what we are experiencing today. This is the .com crash. What you will notice is that we had this low, right? And then we got this low. Go look at Total 3. This low here, and then this low. And then after getting both of these lows, what happened? The altcoin market rallied back up to its 50-week moving average. And in fact, it put in a double top. at the 50-week. The dot-com crash, the NASDAQ, was characterized very similarly, right? A move up and then a double top at the 50-week moving average. We then came back down, back tested the 50-week, and then plummeted down. Same thing with the altcoin market, right? Came down, back tested the 50-week. This back test was the SEC Ripple case, right? I remember that day, I was about to go on vacation and the news came out and I was getting all sorts of comments and text messages, just all sorts of messages. And, to me, it was likely just going to be a lower high and a liquidity grab before going lower. But in the time, right, it's really hard to sort of communicate that to people and have them believe it. They sort of look at it like, oh, this is it. You can't use the charts or the market, whatever, to predict these events. But at the end of the day, the altcoin reckoning hasn't really been necessarily about TA, right? It's just about, we understand that we're in a tightening cycle by the Federal Reserve. And during a tightening cycle where liquidity is being drained, we would assume that the altcoin market would bleed. As liquidity is draining or as liquidity is leaving, the alts are bleeding, right? And you can see clearly that, the altcoin market came back up to the 50-week, got rejected, and now it's kind of just slowly trending down. And that's pretty much what happened with the dot-com crash, right? And the dot-com crash, from that point, right, if you were to take a sort of a date and price range from this top here, it took 40 weeks to bottom out, and it was another 53% drop. For the altcoin market, right, like if you were to look here at from this point, 40 weeks out from that point would actually put you in January, and if you measure it from this peak and compare it to the other chart, it puts you out in February. And then a 50% drop obviously puts you well below the current valuations, right? Puts you well below the current valuations. Now, this pattern that we're looking at is not just something that we have seen in the NASDAQ, right? I mean, some people might say, well, why compare it to the NASDAQ? It was a different time. It was a different market. I think one argument is that the markets move in very similar manners, right? I mean, yes, the exact things that were being traded were different, but it doesn't mean that the human emotion that was involved has changed. And the pattern that you can see in the altcoin market of higher lows but also lower highs is something that we have seen within crypto as well, right? This is exactly what happened with Bitcoin in the prior cycle. And what, if you remember, what ultimately happened with Bitcoin last cycle is it put in these lower highs, it put in higher lows, right? And this is a very similar pattern where you put in this low, you rally to the top. Same thing with Total 3, right? Put in this low here, rally to the top. Bitcoin then came back down and then back up to the top. Total 3 did the same thing right down here, back up to the top. And then Total 3 came back down again, and then a rally back up to the top of the top of the downtrend line. Same thing, right? It's playing out in an eerily similar manner, right? Eerily similar. And what you'll notice is that, well, in this case, it was the bull market support band that ultimately knocked Bitcoin out of this range. And when the move came, it was a drastic move to the downside, right? Very drastic, to the tune of about 50% or so. But you can see just how long we consolidated after this top here, right? So after that top, it took another 10 weeks before the final capitulation really kicked off. So far, from this top, it's already been well more than 10 weeks, right? We're currently at 14 weeks. So I don't know how much longer it's going to take. Again, I could be wrong, and maybe it doesn't break to the downside. But my speculation, based on not only the NASDAQ's pattern and the Bitcoin pattern, but also just kind of seeing where we are in the market cycle, recognizing the last cycle that the altcoin market did not even bottom out until 2 months before the halving. I get that it was a pandemic, but it was, it was a recession, and we could face something similar maybe in Q1 of next year as well. And so all of this has really kept me sort of outside of the altcoin market. And I've said for a long time, right? Like if you're looking for interest in the cryptoverse in the pre-halving year, Bitcoin tends to offer the best risk-adjusted returns. It doesn't mean that some altcoins don't outperform. There's always a few that do. It's just that a majority of them bleed back to Bitcoin. And we can look at a few of them, right? So like if you were to go take a look at ADA, right? It's sitting at around 24 cents right now. And every time it is bounced up, every single time from these lows, the bounce gets more and more pathetic to where we've reached the point where it seems like we're barely bouncing off of these lows. The issue is that eventually, all the buyers who, swarmed in to buy ADA over here at 24 cents and then came back over here to buy it and then came back over here to buy it, right? Eventually, they can't keep supporting the price. And then some of those people end up becoming sellers because they just keep buying it. And when it doesn't go up or when the pattern looks like it's bearish, right? And if it breaks below this, then they end up selling it to try to sort of get what they can. But that is the issue, right? Is you're sort of seeing these altcoins just put in, subsequently more pathetic bounces one after another. Some altcoins are a lot weaker and they've already broken below this range. So, right, like ADA put in this range starting at the end of 2022. Avalanche also put in a low at the end of 2022. But what you'll notice is that it already broke below this range, right? So some of the coins that have had weaker performance have already taken out that range. They came back up to back test it, right? AVAX USD went right back to the bull market support band just to get rejected, and it continues trending down. Polkadot is another example of one that has been a lot weaker, right? And again, what we've talked about with these altcoins is, crypto Twitter can say whatever they want to say about DCAing altcoins, but the reality is anyone who has been buying Polkadot this year, it has not been doing well, right? I mean, this week, Dot put in new lows again, and it feels like every single time I talk about Dot over the last couple of years, right, it's just constantly putting in new lows. And there's this buy the dip crowd that they just buy the dip, but the people that have been buying the dip this year are in the red quite a bit. I mean, even if you bought it, at $6 or $7, you're down 40 to 50%, which is significant. I mean, like it's the same thing as if you bought it at $50 and then you watched it go down to $25, right? It's not any different from, just from a percent loss perspective. And this chart doesn't even do the drop justice, right? Because we know that from these highs, it is down a lot, right? But what's more significant is the Bitcoin valuation, right? The Bitcoin valuation is what you should pay attention to. Look at the Bitcoin valuation of Polkadot. I mean, it has just been in a perpetual bleed ever since May of 2021. And this year alone, Polkadot is down 51% against Bitcoin. It's down 51% against Bitcoin. So had you sort of heeded some of the, sort of the cold shower stuff back in early 2022 and just sort of stuck with that, look at Dot last year, down 55% in 1 year. This year, down 51%, right? So what has DCAing accomplished? Nothing, right? I mean, again, the strategy of just sort of sitting outside of the altcoin market, taking a cold shower and reconsidering rather than getting interested in the altcoin market, I think has stood the test of time. I'm not suggesting that every altcoin will only ever go down, but it is against Bitcoin. But it is true that a lot of altcoins do become relics. They don't all turn into oscillators, right? Some of them are oscillators, some of them just bleed. And we've talked about this as well, right? Like look at Dash Bitcoin from, and just look at the bleed, right? I mean, it never stopped bleeding, right? And you could have made the case at any point, right? I mean, you could have drawn the lines and said, all right, well, maybe here, that's where the low is, and it got a bounce, and then it faded back down. And then maybe over here, you said, all right, well, this is where this top is, so maybe that's where it'll bounce. And it bounced, but it was still a lower high. And it just goes on and on and on, right? Like people, and by the way, this chart, this doesn't go back to 2021, right? It goes back to 2017. This shows you how these altcoins, a lot of them, can become a relic of a prior cycle, right? Where they never stop bleeding against Bitcoin. And this is what I've been trying to warn about for, almost the last 2 years, is that a lot of them just follow this pattern. Sometimes you find one that doesn't and that oscillates, or that's putting in higher lows against Bitcoin. And those are the ones that that are more worthwhile to pay attention to. So like if you're following an altcoin, or there's an altcoin that you would really wish I would talk about, but really deep down I'm probably never going to talk about it because it's too small of a market cap or whatever, hopefully I've given you the tools to navigate it yourself, right? That's what I would want, right? So look to see what the altcoin is doing on its Bitcoin pair, right? Like look to see what it's doing, and if it's putting in higher lows, if it's holding the prior lows, or if it just keeps breaking down to new lows. And a lot of the altcoins just keep breaking down to new lows on their Bitcoin pairs. So the justification for, sticking mostly with Bitcoin is that why buy something that's just bleeding against something that's less risky? Right? It doesn't seem like that complicated of a theory, but there are a lot of people that give me a hard time for these theories. And ADA Bitcoin is something that I've been blasted about all over Twitter for being so bearish on it for so long. I remember back in 2022 when we said it's likely going to go down to 800 sats first, hang out there for a while, and then go to 400, and people didn't like it. Then when it got to 800, then they said it won't go below that. And, now you can see that it's actually breaking the uptrend line, which we said it was probably going to do, right? I mean, this should come as no surprise if you're watching this channel. This uptrend line was not ever meant to hold, as we said, right? It just shows you where it's likely going to consolidate for a few months before ultimately breaking down and likely heading to approximately 400 Satoshis. So the one thing I need to remind people, it's not personal, right? It's not that I necessarily disagree with the fundamental value of any altcoin. It's just because I'm not a Bitcoin maxi, although it might seem like I am. The purpose is to just say that when liquidity dries up, you have to expect the riskiest of assets at the furthest point on the risk curve, which are essentially altcoins, because their value is mostly just dubious speculation. Those are going to get hit the hardest. And most altcoins are oscillators at best, right? They're oscillators at best. So if they're oscillators at best, why would we assume that they're going to put in macro higher lows from one cycle to another over a long enough period of time, right? We wouldn't assume that over, a 5 to 10 year time horizon. They're likely not going to be putting in higher lows. Now, some of them might oscillate, but most of them are not going to be putting in higher lows over, say, like a decade time period, because a lot of them just become relics of a prior cycle. The developer teams move on. They give some BS reason why they had to sell, or why they're leaving. And then the community sort of rationalizes why it's okay, but then the project never really recovers. And I'm a big believer in if the person who created it, or the developers, if they don't believe in it, then why should I, right? I'm a big believer in that. It might sound cold-hearted, but it's the truth. And following that has actually saved me a decent amount of money, right? I mean, there's two ways you navigate crypto, right? There's the people that only ever think about the upside return, and then there's also the people that want to make sure they minimize their downside risk, right? And you try to mix these people together, and it doesn't really go that well, right? So you have one sector of people, one group of people, they are okay, getting smaller returns, but doing so in a safer way. But then you have other people that just want to throw their entire paycheck into whatever altcoin is shilled on Reddit that week, and they don't really care if it goes to zero, because they view that as their only way out of sort of the dilemma that they're in, right? It's just to throw the money in the altcoin market and hope that at some point one of them goes up 100x, right? The problem, again, is in the bear market year and the pre-halving year, a lot of that is all for nothing, because most of these altcoins just keep going down. And it doesn't mean that the altcoins will never recover. It just means that, had you waited, you probably could have gotten a lot more of the altcoin than by DCAing throughout the entire bear market year and the pre-halving year. Now, some people might rightfully point out that, that's very similar to trying to time the market. And I don't think that people are over the long haul are going to be that great at timing the market. But the thing with crypto is that there's sort of like a cheat code, and that is that in bear market years and pre-halving years, the altcoin market, while you don't necessarily know the individual direction of every single altcoin, for the most part, they bleed against Bitcoin, right? So you can still have exposure to crypto via Bitcoin, but by minimizing your downside risk in the altcoin market, right? And I mean, just for completeness, just to give you an example, right? Like taking 1/8 of Bitcoin, what you'll see is, I mean, it's been a fairly bullish trend for a long time, and there's people that acknowledge it, and there are people that don't. But back in I mean, August of 2021, one Bitcoin would have fetched you 16,000 ADA. Now it gets you 117,000 ADA. And if it took you until say 2023 to see the trend, even at the beginning of 2023, one Bitcoin would have fetched you 56,000 ADA. Now you get again 117,000 ADA, right? I mean, so the point is, if you just sat in Bitcoin for even just the pre-halving year, you would have done much better than holding all the individual altcoins except for a few. Now there are a few that have outperformed Bitcoin, and oftentimes the ones that do are either the ones that saw more aggressive losses last year, meaning they went down like 97% or more last year. Those can sometimes do better, or the ones that have smaller market caps and only just recently launched, right? So those are also ones that can do better. The problem is that for every one of those altcoins that does well, there's like 100 that were created that were just that just went to zero, right? So you have to be really careful there. There's a huge element of survivorship bias. If you remember back to like April and May and June, there was the meme coin rally, and I said back then like this stuff just means that there's going the altcoin reckoning is not over. It's very similar to 2019 where we had a meme coin rally in the first half of the year. By the second half of the year, most of those meme coins, people never even spoke about them again, right? They just moved on to the next thing. Okay, so one of the things I've often said when it comes to the altcoin market is that the altcoin reckoning will likely not be over until the collapse of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, right? In the end, even the giants will fall. And if the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation is falling, I'm afraid it's going to take the altcoin market with it, right? And as I've said before, to me, this just simply looks like a massive distribution phase, just like we had last cycle, right? This was also a long distribution phase over here, right? Another distribution phase, and now it seems like we're sort of trending back down. Now, look, I get that people are going to draw support lines, right? I get that, and they're going to try to, and a lot of them just sort of keep, they keep moving the goalposts because their other support lines broke, so then they keep finding new ones. The danger with that is it keeps making people think, okay, let me try now, let me try now, let me try now to see if it'll bounce. And sometimes it gets a little bit of a bounce, but then it just keeps going down, right? And the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation this year, if you look at Heikin-Ashi candles, I mean, legitimately every single candle has been red. If you look at the Heikin-Ashi candles. One of the things that I wanted to mention is if you look at monthly returns of like Ethereum, the Ether Bitcoin valuation, one of the things we said is in the second half of the year, especially in pre-halving years, Ethereum does very poorly against Bitcoin. Now, a lot of people didn't want to hear that back over here in the first half of the year, but I mean, you can see what's been going on in the second half of the year. It's been mostly red, right? I mean, June was red, August was red, September was red, July was green, but it was only 0.13%. October is just over halfway through, and the Ether Bitcoin pair is almost down 12%, right? I mean, almost down 12%. So I still think the Ether Bitcoin pair is going to drop considerably. And again, I know there's a lot of people that disagree with that, but I tend to find that most of the people that disagree were also adamant that it would never go to these levels in the first place. Okay. So again, there's this idea of moving the goalpost and hoping that this one sticks, and then just not really accepting that the bottom, could still be further down, right? I mean, there's always going to be someone there to try to call the bottom. The problem is that most people that try to call the bottom get it wrong. And so I think that until the collapse of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation takes place, where we go to that maybe that 0.03 to 0.04 range, which is still in the realm of prior moves. I mean, like 0.03, 0.04 is still above these levels, right? So I don't really know why it's seen as such an outlandish prediction. But I think 0.03, 0.04, until the collapse of the Ether Bitcoin valuation is complete, I think there's a good chance the altcoin market will continue to bleed. If you look at things like total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, this gives you the idea of the market cap of alts compared to Bitcoin. And again, as we've mentioned previously, they tend to top out at parity with Bitcoin when the altcoin market cap is roughly equivalent to Bitcoin's market cap, and potentially bottom out at about 1/4 or 25%. We've noted that it was likely going to get rejected by the bull market support band, just like it did back over here. And if you zoom in, you can see that the altcoin market against Bitcoin, right, it got to the 20-week and then just sort of rode that 20-week SMA down and is now starting to capitulate once again. And the issue here is that the altcoin market with respect to Bitcoin could drop another 41% just to get back to the prior range lows. Now, why should we assume that we go back to the prior range lows? Right? Well, altcoins are oscillators at best. I've said that before. So if individual altcoins are oscillators at best, why would the collective altcoin market not be an oscillator at best? Why not? You can tell me all you want about how great your altcoin is or how great the community is, but honestly, it doesn't really matter, right? If liquidity is leaving, the alts are bleeding. It doesn't matter what the fundamental value is. If liquidity is draining, there's going to be a headwind for the altcoin market. And I can see this, the social statistics. We did a whole video yesterday on the social risk. People are still leaving. And usually the altcoin market doesn't even bottom out until the social risk starts to go back up, right? There's like a social divergence, like a bullish divergence in terms of social metrics where like prices go lower, but interest is starting to go back up. We haven't even reached that point yet, right? At this point, we're still seeing social interest continue to go down. Remember last cycle, a lot of the altcoins did not even start an uptrend until the halving year, and then they ended up putting in new lows when we had the recession, which means that, I mean, there's a case to be made that at the very least they could lead for the next 2.5 months before there's a real chance that the altcoin reckoning might be over. So when you look at this, you can see that altcoins probably have another 40% to go against Bitcoin to the downside. If you look at total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, which again includes Ethereum, what you'll notice is that it's actually more bearish than the other chart at this point. The other chart has not even taken out the June low, whereas total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, which does include Ethereum, it already has taken out the June low. And this one could drop another 54% against Bitcoin just to get back down to the prior range lows. If you don't believe me, just remember how quickly this market can move to the downside, right? I mean, it went from 72% in June of 2019 to 35% legitimately just like 3 months later, right? It can move quickly when it moves. And the Ethereum dominance is, again, it looks like it's just simply capitulating. And we talked about this. Ethereum dominance could be following something similar to Bitcoin dominance, where the Bitcoin dominance, as we know, puts in higher lows from one cycle to another, but it's also been putting in lower highs. Look at the Ethereum dominance. Lower highs, also higher lows. I contend that it could capitulate all the way down to these levels down here, even though I know it sounds crazy. One interesting metric that I haven't spoken about, I don't think, on here, so you're probably familiar with this chart, total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, but look at this chart. Look at total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. Or sorry, not that one. I want to go back to total 3, but instead of dividing by Bitcoin, divide by ETH. That's what I want to do. You see how when you look at the altcoin market with respect to Ethereum, it found a low here in February 2021 and found another low here in June of 2023. You'll also note that alts with respect to Ethereum have been in a macro downtrend, right? We talk about how altcoins tend to bleed against ETH, right? We used to make videos, right? Does it bleed? A lot of altcoins are still bleeding on the macro scale against ETH. I just haven't been concerned about it because I think Ethereum is also bleeding back to Bitcoin. For the longest time, people didn't believe that. I think it should be fairly true at this point. But what you'll notice is that the last time that when it topped out, last cycle at around the similar time, it actually topped out at the end of the pre-halving year, right? You can see it topped out here in really like January of 2020. So there's a risk here that this goes much higher, meaning alts are going probably down on their USD pairs and on their Bitcoin pairs, but some of the altcoins, as you can see, are actually outperforming Ethereum. And it's just simply because a lot of those altcoins were, got bled dry so much already that yes, they can keep going down, but there's a lot of excess still within Ethereum and the Ether market that needs to get sucked out. And so because of that, while everything has been more or less going down, maybe except for Bitcoin, alts against Ether they've actually been going up. And again, it's because Ethereum has been dropping a lot quicker. One of the reasons that Ethereum, is dropping a lot quicker now is because it's gone below the 0.058 level. We talked about the 0.058 level for a long time. 058 is actually where right here, that's what marked the start of Bitcoin's downtrend back in the last cycle. 0.058 is also where the prior support no longer held, right? If you look at 0.058, you can see that when it crossed 0.058, that's when the losses by the Ether Bitcoin valuation have started to accelerate, just like they really started to accelerate back over there once we crossed 0.058. This first move down over here was in a Bitcoin uptrend, but then once it crossed 0.058, Bitcoin was already in a downtrend, and Bitcoin might already be in a downtrend. We just don't know it yet, right? Or the market hasn't necessarily agreed with that statement yet, and maybe it won't turn out like that. But below 0.058, I think things get pretty dicey for Ethereum because I think it can just move down a lot quicker than people think it can. And if it does, then I think that it takes the altcoin market with it, right? So one thing that I've also wanted to talk a little bit about is, have you ever noticed that a lot of altcoins really underperform Bitcoin in October? I was actually looking at this. Like, if you were to go look at like ADA Bitcoin, right? Has it ever had a green October? Never, right? It's never had a green October. I mean, look at, not all altcoins fall in this, but I mean, a lot of them do, right? I mean, like look at Litecoin Bitcoin. Has it ever had a green October? This is one that's been around since 2013. The Litecoin Bitcoin valuation has never gone up in October. And this October, it's down 13%. Isn't that crazy? Like, I mean, you literally have a decade of history here, and not a single October was the Litecoin Bitcoin valuation green. There's some other ones as well. Some of them obviously don't have as much history. Like if you were to go look at Polkadot Bitcoin, I don't know if it has had a green October or not. It had one in 2021, but most of them have been red, right? And you'll find this for a lot of the altcoins, right? A lot of them just end up being red. Maybe AVAX had one green one, 6% in 2022, but a lot of them are just pretty bad for the altcoin market. And one of the things I think is oftentimes when you get into October, Bitcoin dominance tends to go up, right? A lot of times, Bitcoin dominance is going down into September, and then it reverses course to the upside once September comes and goes. The Bitcoin dominance is something that a lot of people have faded over the last year and a half to 2 years because they thought that this time was different and that the altcoin market was different than it was 4 years ago. Despite all of that, despite all the narratives, the market has not cared. The dominance continues to go higher. The people that call every single time for this to have topped out, they just keep being wrong. They keep prematurely calling for the top, and then dominance just put in new highs, a couple of days ago, right? So you have to be careful because the dominance is playing out in a very similar manner as it has in prior cycles. And if it continues to go up, which I think that it will, it means the altcoin reckoning is likely not over. One way that we have visualized this before is to look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins. And if you look at the Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins and you look at 2023 and you average out 2015 and 2019 into sort of one metric, you'll see that we are closing that gap, right? We said we're likely going to close this gap, and it seems like we are closing the gap, right? Dominance of Bitcoin is going up very quickly. And, I contend that it could continue to go up for the rest of the year. It was only a few weeks ago where a lot of people were saying that September was going to, June was marking the top. But as we know, right, if whatever direction Bitcoin dominance is going into September, it tends to reverse course. So had Bitcoin dominance gone up through September, then perhaps by September it would have turned around. But since we fell back into September, you can see once we got to September, things reverse course. Now the dominance is heading back up. You can look at the chart and see that pretty much every September, that's where the turnaround point is, no matter the direction that Bitcoin's going, or whatever the direction dominance is going, it tends to reverse course in September. It has happened many, many times. And here's an example where it was going up into September and then reverse course, right? So here's an example where it was going up into September and then reverse course. But if it's going down into September, then it means it usually goes up after it. And we've seen that, we've seen that time and time again. Here's another example. September went low and then it started to go back up. So that continues to play out more or less how we would have expected, right? So if Bitcoin dominance is to sort of make this move back up to the upside, what happens to the altcoin market? Now, remember, Bitcoin pre-halving years often mean both bulls and bears get wrecked, right? Now, it is true that a lot of bears have been wrecked in the altcoin market. I mean, a lot of the altcoins are putting in new lows. That hasn't necessarily been true yet in the Bitcoin market. I mean, Bitcoin has mostly moved up, and then it basically just been going sideways. If Bitcoin were to sneeze to the downside by just a few $1,000s, you have to ask yourself, if Bitcoin were to drop just back to the prior range lows, how does the altcoin market hold this higher low structure, right? How does it hold this structure? And if it breaks down like Bitcoin did last cycle and like the NASDAQ did, 20 something years ago, and if the altcoin market drops 50%, just like these prior cycles that we've looked at, that means the dominance could go up very quickly. And that was the altcoin market, right? That doesn't even include Ethereum, which has, in my opinion, has sort of stood up stronger than the altcoin market for the last year and a half, and it's led to a lot of people saying that ETH keeps holding up well. I think the problem is that people are just going to keep saying it's holding up well until it's blatantly obvious that it's not holding up well anymore, right? So, and again, like we're in the process of watching this ratio collapse, and I think a lot of people are so distracted by Bitcoin that they're not necessarily watching the fact that these altcoins are absolutely plummeting right now. If you wanted to look at a scary chart, I did a video on this the other day, the advanced decline index for the top 100 cryptocurrencies. Just go watch the video. I'm not going to go through the whole description again. Look at this chart. I mean, it gives you an idea of the breadth or lack thereof. The altcoin market right now has been essentially in free fall. And the reason people have not noticed, the reason why some people have not noticed, is because they're too busy watching what Bitcoin's doing to even care. And their altcoins are sort of holding on, right? Like you could sort of rationalize, well, DOT's at 362, A is at, 24 cents. Maybe they'll hold, maybe they won't. But the issue is that if Bitcoin drops at all and the altcoin market is already sitting precariously on these lows, what happens if they break through and it opens up a windfall type event where it moves to the downside very quickly? That's the issue, is that there's really no room for error by Bitcoin as far as the altcoin market goes. If Bitcoin goes down at all, how does the altcoin market hold up? Bitcoin's been going up and the altcoin market's going down, right? Look at this trend. I mean, like Bitcoin's been going up. Alts, they just keep going down. This is fascinating if you look at this. You see this Bitcoin chart? You see how, Bitcoin has been moving higher? Look at Ethereum. It's been moving lower, right? You can see that clear trend, right? Like overlay Bitcoin USD onto this chart. Look at the divergence in the trend here, right? Bitcoin goes up, Ethereum goes down. We've talked about this forever, right? We said the Bitcoin dominance goes up no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. And some people say, well, when's that going to start happening? Guys, look at the last 9 weeks of Bitcoin dominance. They're all green, 9 weeks in a row. I'm pretty sure early on, after only 2 or 3 weeks, we said this is likely going to be a long run, just like the dollar, because the dollar did 11 green weeks in a row. This is 9 in a row right here for dominance. But Bitcoin USD is only green for 3 of those weeks. So for 6 weeks, Bitcoin went down on its USD pair and the dominance of Bitcoin still went up. So it shows you no matter no matter the direction that Bitcoin goes, the dominance goes up. Now, sometimes people get sort of drawn into, moves that happen in a single day, right? Like, so if Bitcoin were to drop and the dominance temporarily goes down, make people say, oh, how's the dominance holding up? But the problem is that it just ends up putting in a higher low, right? It puts in a higher low, and the altcoins put in a lower high on their Bitcoin pairs, and then they put in a lower low. So I think that you have to be careful with the altcoin market, because what normally happens is that Bitcoin gets like a secondary scare before the halving, which is pretty brutal, and it wipes out the altcoin market, right? I mean, you could see 50% drop here, 50% drop here, not even including the pandemic. And when you get those drops by Bitcoin, that's where the altcoin market gets crushed. And the reason the altcoin market gets crushed is because they're bleeding out now just to support Bitcoin, right? The reason Bitcoin hasn't gone anywhere and is still at 28K is not, I think, because new money coming in, because the total market cap has basically stayed the same, right? Total market cap has been trending sideways, right? Look at total market cap. It's just been going sideways for a long time. The only reason Bitcoin's going up, in my opinion, or the main reason, is because these alts are bleeding back to Bitcoin, right? So Bitcoin is sucking the liquidity in, right? It's everywhere. It's sucking that liquidity back in and using that liquidity to stay at an elevated level. But at some point, the liquidity from the altcoin market will be completely bled dry, right? It'll basically be gone. That doesn't mean the prices are at zero. It just means that everyone who's going to leave will have finally left. They'll have been bled dry. And then when Bitcoin searches for that liquidity in the altcoin market as sort of like what it needs to continue to stay elevated on its USD pair, it looks and there's just no liquidity anywhere, right? And that's when Bitcoin drops. The king bends the knee, crushes the altcoin market, and then after that, the altcoin market starts to outperform for a while, right? And that's where the oversized gains in the altcoin market come from. It's because they just get bled dry for so long, then Bitcoin drops and there's no buyers, right, for the altcoins because they've already been bled dry. The buyers are exhausted. The buyers, a lot of these altcoins, they've been buying them all year and they just get exhausted. And if Bitcoin were to drop, 40%, 50%, how can the altcoin market withstand that move without dropping below this level? And if it drops below this level, then you saw what happened with the NASDAQ. It was negative 50%. You saw what happened with Bitcoin last cycle. It was negative 50%. So that, I think, is the issue, right? That is the issue. Now, these views have been met with a lot of criticism over the last couple of years. But I put forth to you, it has not yet been wrong, right? I mean, it has not yet been wrong. And I've heard a lot of people say things like, well, what if you're wrong about altcoins? And I think to myself, like, how much longer do these altcoins need to put in new lows before people actually accept that that was the right thesis, right? I mean, it's not like the other view was correct. It's not like if you had been bullish on the altcoin market for the last 2 years, it's not like you were doing well. So it's like, at what point do those people recognize that this is, likely this is what's happening? And once those people recognize it, that's usually when the final capitulation takes place. But it goes to show you that no matter how low these altcoins go, there's always going to be someone out there that thinks like, well, what if you're wrong, right? Like, what if they don't go lower? But it's like, they keep going lower, I mean, how else can you look at these charts? You look at these altcoins and they just keep dropping. Like Litecoin looks like it's just in a little consolidation phase, just like 2019, before it just sort of plummeted down again. And this next drop eventually came in November, right? And then we, of course, had the recession in the following year. So, I mean, at what point, what does it take to convince people? And I think once you get to that answer, once we get to the point where people are convinced, that's where the secondary scare for Bitcoin comes in, because those people capitulate their alts. They maybe go back to Bitcoin, they go back to USD, and then the next time there's a risk-off environment for Bitcoin, there's no liquidity anywhere. And then Bitcoin drops. And then the secondary scare terminates, and then we go on a new bull market. but only after the altcoin market has been bled dry. And the reason is because in a tightening cycle, liquidity flows from higher risk assets to lower risk assets. And you can really visualize this with something like, looking at total 3 and overlaying the net liquidity, right? So if you look at the net liquidity here and you overlay it, you can see that the altcoin market really does follow net liquidity quite closely, right? And so, assuming the higher lows break on the altcoin market, if it does eventually track net liquidity, and there's a big drop coming, right? I mean, there's your 50% drop. It's kind of like the S&P sort of tracks net liquidity, but not nearly as closely, and the jaws can often open on net liquidity and the S&P, right? So you can see here the jaws opened in Q1 of this year, but the jaws have opened before, right? Like this isn't the first time. The issue is that when the jaws open, it just, typically what it means is that at some point there's going to be a reckoning where we sort of complete this triangle and the S&P goes back to where net liquidity is, right? You can see it happened again here where, eventually we sort of collapsed into where net liquidity was. And it wasn't until net liquidity went really, went much higher that the S&P really followed and did not come back down to these lower levels. So now you're sort of looking at the same thing with the S&P and net liquidity, where the S&P, the jaws have opened, but at some point they're likely going to clamp shut. And I put forth this idea too that until the Fed pivots, there's likely not a great case to be made for the altcoin market. Right now, maybe they bottom out around the Fed pivot. Maybe it's possible they bottom out slightly before. I don't really know, but maybe it depends on how hard they get hit between now and then. But the issue is that the Fed is not going to pivot more than likely until after the S&P drops, and the S&P is not going to drop until the labor market shows weakness. And it's just been a long process. Now we are nearing the point where you would expect to see some weakness, right? Like if you were to look at yield curve stuff, right? Like treasury yield spreads, what you'll notice is that after uninversion, we typically get a recession. And sometimes we get a recession before the uninversion process takes place. But one interesting thing to look at is to look at things like the ROI to low after yield curve inversion for various metrics, right? So like you could look at various macroverse metrics and say, well, what is what are some good ones that we can look at? What is maybe we should look at total non-farm employees, right? What is total non-farm employees doing after inversion of the yield curve? And you can kind of follow how there are cycles, right? Let me get rid of the 2019 one, right? There are cycles where it goes up for a while, but then eventually it rolls over. And it's been going up a lot this cycle, but it doesn't mean that eventually it won't roll over. You can look at other things like, what are some other good ones? Like, and again, depending on what you look at, like some look worse than others. You could look at like the coincident economic activity index and kind of see where 2022 is right here, right? It's, right now it seems like it's tracking the financial crisis the closest. But there's all sorts of models that you can look at where, they track it for a while and then eventually it sort of rolls over. And the issue is that we are sort of getting into the point, after about 12 months of inversion, that's where that risk starts to really open up. It doesn't mean that you have to have a recession, right? It could just be a recession scare, but regardless of whether it is, like the S&P tends to not react that well, right? The hard part is knowing when that happens, right? And I mean, I don't know when it's going to happen. I honestly, I don't know if it's going to be this year. I don't know if it's going to be next year. I don't know. But there are plenty of metrics that you can look at where, and one of them is like income, or sorry, not income, imports. I want to look at imports, like imports of goods and services. That one's been going down since yield curve inversion, right? It's already been going down. Whereas after the financial crisis, or in the financial crisis, and in 1981, it actually went up first. But 2022, it's been going down, right? You can see it right in here. 2022, it's been going down, and the issue is like at some point, a lot of these macro metrics sort of plateau, and then they start to fall back down. And I don't know how long that's going to take. So I think there is reason, valid reasons to have been concerned about the altcoins. And every time I make these videos, I understand there's a risk that the altcoin market just goes back up or something in the next week or something. But as we look back over the last 2 years, and we look at all the prior altcoin reckoning videos, Every single time the altcoin market formed a lower high. Every single move by the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation has been a lower high. Every single move by the Bitcoin dominance has been a higher low, right? It's all been taking place. It's just that so many people get lost in short-term moves that they miss the bigger picture of what's actually going on, right? And I think that's the issue, is that a lot of these altcoins are just, the main purpose that they're doing right now in this market is they're supporting Bitcoin's valuation, right? That's the reason Bitcoin's holding strong, is because these altcoins, they just keep bleeding, right? This is what they do in pre-halving years. They just simply bleed. And at some point, the liquidity's gone. And at that point, Bitcoin, rolls over, has a secondary scare, crushes the altcoin market. So the altcoin reckoning is a very serious matter. I think it, I think we are certainly in the latter stages of it. Like, I don't think it's going to last that much longer, but certainly we could still have a few months to go. So hopefully we'll see this thing. Hopefully we will see this thing through to the end. And once we get to the end of the altcoin reckoning, and once we get on the other side of a Fed pivot, then it will be time to focus on the altcoin renaissance, where the Cryptoverse is slowly built back up after we no longer have these, liquidity or lack of liquidity headwinds in front of us, right? So then we try to rebuild the Cryptoverse, liquidity comes back, the altcoin market starts to pop off again, and the Cryptoverse can return to its glory days. I know it seems bad right now, but it always feels like this every single cycle. And then Bitcoin has a way of making its move sometime after the halving, right? Sometime after the halving, Bitcoin will make its move. Now, what happens if we get a recession after the halving? I don't know. That could throw a wrench into it. I'm sort of hoping that the recession risk gets resolved before the halving, but there's always a chance that doesn't happen. And if that plays out like that, then we'll take that into consideration, right? I mean, it's just you play with the cards that you're dealt, right? We cannot control the cards that we're given, but the ones we're given, we play those. And so we will take it one step at a time, see where the altcoin market goes, see where alt Bitcoin pairs go, and take inventory on that by the end of the year, and see at what point is the altcoin market, at what point has it been bled dry. And at this point, I still think it likely has a bit more to go. So if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. I know it's not the most joyful message that you heard, but I can at least say it has been a consistent message. Dominance higher, Ether Bitcoin lower, and so far it has played out. Okay? We'll see what happens by the end of the year. So far it's played out. I think it will continue to play out. The Bitcoin dominance should break much higher. Ether Bitcoin, I'm guessing, will go a lot lower. So too will alt Bitcoin pairs, likely alt USD pairs as well. And then we will see sort of what carnage is left over after the altcoin reckoning is over. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe. See you guys next time. Bye.